Why did she feel more nervous here than over hostile skies? The Boeing 757 carved through the afternoon sky at 35,000 feet. But Sarah Martinez barely noticed the familiar sensation of flight. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of seat 13F, watching Kansas pass beneath her in neat squares of farmland and irrigation, circles that looked like a quilt stitched by unseen hands. To anyone else, it was an ordinary view. To Sarah, it was almost unreal. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't wearing a uniform. The jeans felt strange, stiff, too new against her skin after endless rotations of flight suits and combat gear, the navy sweater her sister Elena had bought her for Christmas. Still smelling faintly of lavender detergent, clung to her shoulders in a way she wasn't used to. Her body missed the weight of Kevlar, the bulk of tactical harnesses. Even sitting here, she unconsciously held her posture like the academy had, drilled into her 2 decades ago spine straight, hands symmetrical on the armrests, feet flat on the floor, alert even in repose. Old habits, she thought, with a trace of bitterness. General Patricia Hayes had ordered her to take this leave. Martinez, if I see you in my office before May 1st, I will personally have MPs drag you to a beach chair. Sarah hadn't argued. She just nodded, filed the last reports, and boarded a commercial flight like a civilian. But the truth was, she didn't know how to be one anymore. She shifted in her seat, eyes scanning the cabin the way they always had routes to the exits. Count of passengers within her section, locations of fire extinguishers, she cataloged. Threats without meaning to. It was instinct now, muscle memory of survival. The flight attendant paused by her row, smiling with the warmth of someone who had seen every kind of traveler. Coffee? She asked softly. Sarah nodded. Please. The woman's name tag read Jennifer Walsh. Her hands were practiced, steady even in turbulence as she refilled Sarah's cup. The smell was sharp, almost grounding. Jennifer studied her a moment longer. Than most passengers, she noticed it, the posture, the eyes that never rested, the precision with which Sarah had stowed her bag overhead. Military? She asked quietly. Sarah's grip on the cup tightened. She'd hoped to disappear into anonymity, just another face among 127 others on United Flight 847. But the disguise of civilian clothes wasn't enough. Something always gave her away. She lowered her voice. Air Force. Jennifer's expression softened, her voice dipping lower. My husband was Navy 22 years. 3 deployments, retired last year. She glanced around. Ensuring privacy. I can always tell. It's in the way you carry yourselves. Sarah managed a faint smile, though it felt like she was being seen in a way she hadn't wanted. Something like that. Whatever you did, wherever that was. Jennifer's tone carried the gravity of someone who knew the costs. Thank you. As the attendant moved on, Sarah exhaled slowly. Gratitude always unsettled her. She didn't see herself as a hero. She thought of nights in Afghanistan, of decisions that still haunted her. Some people came home because of her. Others didn't. That ledger never balanced. The cabin around her pulsed with ordinary life. Beside her, a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, his headset blinking as he argued about projections. Across the aisle, a mother wrestled with twin toddlers. Their father slumped in exhausted sleep with a military ID peeking from his wallet. Behind, college students laughed over something on a phone screen, voices bright with the casual invincibility of youth. None of them knew that the woman at the window had once coaxed a crippled F-16 over the Hindu Kush. Hydraulics failing, radar screaming, enemy fire chasing her all the way home. None knew she had been awarded a medal she never looked at, or that her call sign Phoenix had spread through squadrons like folklore. To them, she was just another passenger, a teacher maybe, or someone heading home for a family visit, exactly how she wanted it. Her eyes closed, though not in sleep, just trying to remember what normal felt like, the last time she had. sat somewhere without mapping threats. Without the gnawing hum of adrenaline in her bloodstream, she listened. The laughter, the bickering of siblings, the soft snore of a stranger behind her, and beneath it all, the steady hum of the engines. Safe skies. Her shoulders began to relax, fraction by fraction. This, she thought, is why we fight. Not speeches, not medals. This, ordinary people. Ordinary lives, untouched by chaos. She smiled faintly, for now she was invisible. But there was something. She hadn't told them, not yet. The first sign came as a vibration, so subtle she felt it in her bones before her mind named it. Her eyes snapped open. Not turbulence, not normal. Her hand braced against the window frame automatically. 2 hours into a 5-hour flight, 3:47 p.m., Mountain Time, a pulse through the airframe. Too low frequency, too persistent. Around her, no one noticed. The businessman frowned at a spreadsheet. The toddlers giggled at a tray table latch. But Sarah had felt this before Kandahar. Her F-16's hydraulic pump dying mid-air. The bird trembling like it wanted to fall apart. Her instincts whispered danger. The vibration grew. A shudder that tipped coffee in plastic cups. The businessman cursed as his laptop snapped shut. Across the aisle, the young mother pulled her boys close, unease in her eyes. Then Captain Thompson's voice over the intercom. Calm, rehearsed, too calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please return to your seats and fasten seatbelts. Minor technical difficulties. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd used that phrase, her self-euphemism for catastrophe in progress. Never admit how bad it is. Never alarm the passengers. The shudder deepened in a violent shaking. Luggage rattled. Phones clattered to the floor. A scream pierced the cabin. The students behind her stopped laughing, eyes wide. Sarah's mind had already shifted gears. Cold, clinical. Checklists firing through memory. Nose pitching unevenly, vibrations irregular. Changes in engine harmonics. She didn't need to see the cockpit to know multiple hydraulic system failures. The controls fighting back. A sound split the air. Metal grinding deep within the belly of the plane. Like gears losing their teeth. 3 seconds of nightmare. Sarah processed a dozen possibilities in that window. None good. The intercom crackled again. Strain bleeding through the captain's practiced voice. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency procedures. Passengers, review your safety cards. We may need to perform an emergency landing. The word emergency sliced through the cabin. The businessman went pale. The mother clutched her children tighter. Someone whispered, "Oh God, oh God." The oxygen masks dropped with a thud, swaying like yellow blossoms. Sarah's hands moved automatically, fitting her mask, eyes darting. But then the nose dipped. Steep. Too steep. This wasn't preparation. This was an uncontrolled descent. Panic. Erupted, screams, prayers, passengers fumbling with masks, grabbing at strangers' hands. Parents clutched children. The air was thick with fear, raw and unfiltered. But Sarah Martinez was somewhere else. Not a passenger, not Sarah in jeans, Phoenix, pilot brain calculating, cataloging, unrecoverable within minutes. Manual reversion only, engines fighting physics. With brute force, she could see it already, Colorado's earth rising fast through her window. Unforgiving and close, she'd been here before. Not in this plane, but the same feeling, the same knowledge. Survival wasn't guaranteed, except this time, she wasn't in the cockpit. She was powerless, a passenger, and Sarah Martinez had never accepted powerlessness. Her mind clicked, the decision forming like steel in her chest. She might be in jeans and a sweater. She might be anonymous in 13F, but she was still a pilot, still a warrior. Still someone who had sworn an oath to protect. The Boeing 757 bucked, trembling, its engines groaning. 127 lives hung in the balance, and in that chaos, Sarah Martinez was no longer content to be just another passenger. She was Phoenix, and it was time to go to work. What would she say to make them believe her? Jennifer Walsh was steady on her feet after 12 years as a flight attendant. But this cabin was unlike anything she'd seen. Emergency training prepared her for turbulence, for passengers fainting, for smoke in the galley. But this was terror unfolding in slow motion. The aisle tilted under her as the aircraft shuddered. Oxygen masks dangling like accusing eyes. Parents sobbed. Children wailed. Adults clutched at strangers. Fear wasn't orderly. It was a symphony of chaos. But as Jennifer worked her way forward, checking passengers, her gaze kept snapping back to 13F. The woman there wasn't panicking, wasn't praying. She sat with an almost unnerving calm, her eyes scanning the cabin as if cataloging every detail. Not with fear, but with assessment. When Jennifer reached her row, the woman caught her wrist with a grip that was firm but not desperate. "Jennifer," she said, her voice cutting clean through the panic. The use of her name startled her. Few passengers bothered to notice. The woman's tone carried no hysteria, no pleading. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis. "I need to talk to the captain." Jennifer almost laughed, except nothing about the situation was funny. "Ma'am, please keep your mask on. Stay seated. The pilots are handling it." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "And I'm a pilot, United States Air Force. I've dealt with multiple hydraulic failures before. I can help." For a second, Jennifer froze. Protocol screamed in her ears. Passengers don't enter cockpits. FAA rules, federal offenses. But another violent shudder ripped through the plane. Overhead bins rattling, trays clattering to the floor. The look in the woman's eyes was steady, unshakable. "What kind of pilot?" Jennifer asked, leaning closer, fighting the lurch of the plane. "Fighter pilot. F-16s mostly. I've brought damaged aircraft home before." The conviction in her tone, the calm in her face, it left no room for doubt. Another violent lurch sealed it. Jennifer's training had never covered this, but instinct made the decision for her. She reached for her master key. "Follow me." They pushed forward through the aisle. The cabin was a storm of human desperation, passengers fumbling with masks. Whispering prayers, clutching hands, Sarah grabbed the intercom handset near the galley. She pressed the button, her voice cutting across the chaos like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force." The cabin stilled, even in panic. Something about her voice commanded attention. Calm, confident, unyielding. "I want everyone to listen carefully. We are going to get through this. Stay calm. Follow instructions from the crew. The pilots are good, very good. I'm going to help them bring us home." The transformation was almost immediate. Panic softened into quiet sobs. The keening cries dulled into focused silence. Hope is contagious, and her voice carried it like oxygen. As she passed her row, the businessman beside her caught her arm, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. "You're really Air Force?" "Yes, sir," she said, squeezing his shoulder gently. "We're going to be fine." The words weren't a guarantee, but they were a promise, and promises mattered. At the cockpit door, Jennifer's key clicked in the lock. The door opened. To a world both familiar and strange, Sarah stepped into the tight space, her pulse steadying. It wasn't an F-16. The panels were wider, the yokes heavier. The cockpit crowded with civilian complexity, but the desperate struggle was the same. Captain Mike Thompson and First Officer Lisa Chun were drenched in sweat, their knuckles white on the controls. The Boeing bucked beneath them, fighting every command. They barely glanced at the intruder before returning to their instruments, their faces carved from focus and fear. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force." "I can help," Captain Thompson shot her a look, half disbelief, half irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is complex. You've lost primary hydraulics." Sarah's words came sharp, precise, fast. Backup systems failing or already gone. You're getting maybe 20% authority at best. You're riding differential thrust. Just to keep her straight. Nose authority degrading by the minute. Angle of attack increasing. You've got maybe 10 minutes before she becomes unrecoverable. The cockpit froze. The captain stared at her. That had taken 12 seconds every word was true. How do you? First Officer Chun started. Because I've been here, Sarah said, sliding into the jump seat behind them. Different bird. Same fight. I brought an F-16 home through the Hindu Kush with total hydraulic failure, my Falcon. Didn't have redundancies. This Boeing does. We can work with that. Thompson hesitated, eyes locked on hers. In her expression, he saw what only another pilot could recognize, the calm of someone who had looked death in the eye and flown through. What do you need? He asked. Permission to fly. Without waiting, Sarah grabbed the spare headset, slipped it on, and keyed the mic. Denver Center, United 847. Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force, call sign Phoenix, assisting flight crew with emergency procedures. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable runway. Full emergency services on standby. The frequency went silent. Seconds ticked, then a voice, steady but tinged with awe. United 847, Denver Center. Confirm call. Sign. Phoenix? Confirmed. Another pause. Then a different voice, stronger now, almost reverent. Denver Center copies. Phoenix is on station. Coordination underway. The airwaves erupted behind the scenes. Controllers, military liaisons, supervisors. Sarah could hear the murmur of disbelief bleeding through the channel. The legend they'd only heard about was suddenly in their ear. She leaned forward, eyes on Captain Thompson. Mike? Can I call you Mike? I need you to trust me. What I'm going to ask will feel wrong, but it's the only way we're walking away. He studied her for a long beat. Then he nodded once, sharp. Tell me. Her hands moved like a conductor orchestrating chaos. She outlined emergency procedures, not in any civilian manual techniques fighters learned when survival meant improvisation. Energy management, non-standard approaches, muscle where hydraulics had failed, and somewhere across the Rockies. Alerts were flashing on military bases, Peterson, Buckley, Cheyenne Mountain. Within minutes, scramble orders were cut. At Buckley, Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez read the alert twice, his blood chilling. United 847 in emergency. Phoenix on board. Assistance required. He looked across the ready room at his wingman. Captain Amy Chun. Guardian Angel mission, he said quietly. Phoenix needs us. Within 4 minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors thundered off the runway, afterburners igniting the Colorado sky. Their mission: escort a crippled Boeing 757 carrying 127 souls and a legend inside Denver Center. Controller Jake Morrison's hand hovered over his coffee as the words still echoed in his headset. Phoenix. He'd worked Bagram once, years ago. He remembered the chatter, the stories of the pilot who always came back. Now she was on his frequency. United 847 Denver Center. Jake said into the mic. Military escort inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Colonel Martinez. How copy? Sarah's voice came back, steel wrapped in calm. Denver Center. Phoenix copies. Appreciate the escort. We're maintaining course for Denver International. This approach will be unconventional. Prepare crash equipment, full length of runway. Her. Words carried across radios, across bases, across states, in ready rooms. Pilots stopped mid-sentence. At Nellis, maintainers turned up radios. At Langley, a colonel froze in his briefing. Across the world, the name Phoenix rippled again. But inside the cockpit, Sarah's world had narrowed. Instruments, airspeed, angle of descent. Hand steady, mind quiet. She wasn't supposed to be here. Just a passenger in 13F. A tired officer on leave, but fate had other plans. And for the 127 lives on board, Sarah Martinez had just become their last hope. Why did 3 words silence the entire control room? Call sign Phoenix. The moment Sarah's transmission hit the frequency, air traffic controllers, officers, and old pilots across the country froze. Stories of that name had been whispered. For years, missions over mountains, impossible landings, rescues no textbook could explain. To hear it now, in the middle of an emergency, was like hearing a ghost answer the radio. At Denver Center, controller Jake Morrison sat straighter, heart pounding. He'd been Air Force once. He remembered Bagram. He remembered watching her F-16 limping home through sand and smoke, her wingmen swearing over the frequency that they'd never make it. But she always had. Denver Center, confirm call sign Phoenix, Jake repeated, his voice steadier than his racing pulse. Sarah's reply was immediate. Confirmed. Phoenix is on station and assisting. In bases across Colorado, alarms flared. At Peterson Space Force Base, staff pulled up her record so classified most of it was black lines. What remained was enough. Combat sorties, distinguished flying cross, tactical innovations still. Taught to cadets at Buckley, Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez was already in the air, throttling his F-22 skyward with Captain Amy Viper Chun tied on his wing. United 847, Hawk flight inbound. He radioed. Phoenix, it's Hawk. How can we assist? Inside the Boeing's cockpit, Sarah glanced at Captain Thompson, then keyed the mic. Her tone carried that dry, impossible humor she used to steady rookies. Good to hear your voice, Hawk. We're going to Denver International. I'll meet. Some magic with approach control. We'll be fast, steep, and probably sideways. Copy that, Phoenix. Hawk's tone was professional, but behind it was awe. If anyone could land a crippled Boeing, it was her. In the jump seat, Sarah's. Focus sharpened into what fighter pilots called the zone. Instruments became extensions of instinct. She helped Thompson coax the aircraft onto a heading. First Officer Lisa Chun rattled off emergency checklist items with machine-like precision. For a brief moment, chaos gave way to rhythm. But outside the cockpit, word was spreading like fire at Langley. Sarah's former commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, left a budget meeting mid-sentence, his aide blurting, "Sir, Colonel Martinez is aboard a civilian aircraft hydraulic failure. She's flying it." Webb closed his eyes. He remembered the captain with fire in her eyes. Too skilled for her years. "Get me updates every 5 minutes," he ordered. Though his voice betrayed pride he couldn't contain. At Nellis, Master Sergeant Tony Castellanos, who had turned wrenches on her jets through 3 deployments, grabbed his radio. Hands trembling, he remembered watching her bring back planes that should have been coffins. "Phoenix," he whispered, listening as her voice cut steady through the static. At Ramstein in Germany, at Osan in Korea, at bases stretched across the globe, squadrons huddled around radios, veterans who had flown with her, cadets who had studied her tactics, maintainers who'd fueled her jets. They all listened. But inside the cabin of United 847, none of that mattered yet. The passengers only knew they were falling in a machine that no longer wanted to fly until Maria Santos, the young mother of twins, caught something on the overhead broadcast. She'd been listening through the in-flight channel, her boys curled against her sides. She heard the name, Phoenix. It meant nothing to her at first, but when she repeated it aloud, the businessman beside her looked up sharply. "My brother's Air Force," said one of the college kids behind them. "He talks about some pilot called Phoenix all the time. Says she's like a legend." "That's her," Robert Kim, the businessman, whispered, his voice shaking with wonder. "The legend is flying our plane." The words rippled through the cabin like a current. Passengers passed it down row by row. A colonel, an Air Force pilot, a woman who'd saved lives in combat, a hero. Whispers carried through trembling hands and tear-streaked faces. For the first time since the masks had dropped, Hope flickered in the cockpit. Sarah ignored the growing legend outside. She had no use for it. Her world had narrowed to numbers and physics. Mike, we'll need to think like test pilots now. Everything about this approach is going to feel wrong. Too fast, too steep. Trust me. Thompson swallowed, eyes on the horizon line wavering across his instruments. I've flown 23 years. I've never been a passenger on a Boeing. Sarah interrupted gently, a ghost of a smile. Guess we're both breaking new ground. The plane bucked again. Sarah steadied her breathing, voice crisp into the mic. Denver Center, Phoenix, we need runway 16 right. Cleared and held, every foot of it. Emergency vehicles standing by. Roger that, Phoenix, came the reply. And then, quieter, almost reverent. The entire aviation community is pulling for you. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't afford to carry that weight. She focused instead on airspeed bleeding away too fast. Altitude unwinding like a clock she couldn't stop. Behind the aircraft, Hawk and Viper slid into formation. Two sleek guardians bracketing the wounded Boeing. From their cockpits, they could see the shudder in the 757's wings. The erratic tilt of its nose. It looked less like a plane and more like a bird fighting death. Denver Tower, Hawk transmitted, his voice steady. Hawk Flight has visual. United 847 appears stable for now. Phoenix is at the controls. The reply was instant. Copy, Hawk Flight. Clear skies all the way. Emergency services deployed. Runway yours. And still. Across the world, people listened. Retired pilots in Arizona radios crackling in their garages. Cadets in Colorado abandoning classes to cluster in common rooms. Mechanics at Shaw and Edwards leaning against tool benches, radios tuned. But Sarah didn't know. Or maybe she did. And chose not to think about it. Her gaze never left the dials. Every correction was a battle. Every second a victory. She was just a passenger in 3rd and F, wasn't she? No, not anymore. Not Phoenix. Not today. How many people were holding their breath at that exact moment? At 39,000 feet above Colorado, the Boeing 757 looked like a wounded bird trying to hold itself together. Its wings rocked unevenly despite calm skies. Its nose dipped. In erratic pulses, from the sleek cockpit of his F-22 Raptor, Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez could see the struggle. He eased his jet closer, holding formation 500 feet off the airliner's wing. It looked worse up close, the heavy jet wallowing, its engines straining, its control surfaces twitching like nerves misfiring. He pressed his mic. United 847. Hawk Flight has you. Inside Phoenix, it's Hawk. We're with you. How do you want us? Inside the Boeing's cramped cockpit, Sarah didn't look away from her instruments. Her voice stayed calm, almost casual. Hawk, good to hear you. We're aiming for Denver International. Clear me 16 right, every foot of it. And forget textbook procedures, we're gonna come in fast. Steep, maybe sideways. Hawk exhaled, a faint smile crossing his face beneath the mask. Phoenix was still Phoenix understatement, laced with impossible demands. Copy that, already coordinating. In her left seat, First Officer Lisa Chun. Rattled off callouts, airspeed fluctuating, hydraulic pressure bleeding away. Manual reversion responses lagging by full seconds. She was calm, but Sarah could hear the strain in her voice. Mike, Sarah said to Captain Thompson, think like a test pilot. It's going to feel wrong. Too much speed, too much nose down, but it's what gives us control authority. Trust it. His jaw flexed, sweat dripping at his temples. He nodded once. The radios lit up again. Denver approach to United 847. Be advised. All traffic cleared within 20 miles. Runway 16 right is yours. Emergency services standing by. Sarah's voice carried across civilian and military. Frequencies. Broadcast now to hundreds listening. Copy. Denver. All stations. "This is Phoenix. We're coming home. Stand by." And suddenly, across the country, the story was no longer just an emergency. It was an event at Langley. Colonel Marcus Webb stood before a crowd of airmen gathered around a large radar display. The green blip of United 847 was flanked by two smaller points, the Raptors. "That's my pilot," he said quietly. His voice carried pride like a weight. At Nellis, Master Sergeant Castellanos stood in a hangar surrounded by mechanics. His radio turned loud. "She once dead-sticked a Falcon through a sandstorm with half a wing missing." He muttered, "If anyone can put that bird down, it's Phoenix." At Ramstein, pilots crowded ready rooms long past midnight. At Osan, briefings paused as crews tuned in. Around the world, from maintenance bays to control towers, veterans and rookies alike leaned closer to radios. The legend was no longer whispered. It was live. But inside United 847's cabin, passengers were still strapped in, eyes wide, masks over mouths. Fear hadn't vanished. It never does. But something else had settled in. Faith. The rumor had reached nearly everyone now. A decorated colonel, a fighter pilot, the Phoenix, Maria Santos whispered to her twins. "The lady pilot is flying us now. She's going to get us home." Robert Kim muttered prayers mixed with disbelief. The college kids clutched each other, repeating the word Phoenix like it was a shield. Jennifer Walsh moved up and down the aisle, calming, instructing. For the first time in the chaos, she carried something more than procedure in her voice. Hope. On the ground, Denver International was transformed. Emergency vehicles lined runway 16 right in a display more like a military exercise than a civilian airport. Fire trucks foamed their lines. Ambulances waited, engines idling. Crash recovery teams staged equipment. The Colorado Air National Guard scrambled helicopters to circle nearby, ready for evacuation if needed. Airport manager Susan Morrison had seen blizzards, terror scares, mechanical failures, but never this. She counted 37 vehicles in position, and still more arriving. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," she said into her headset. Her voice betrayed what her heart feared. Sometimes readiness wasn't enough. But Denver wasn't the only place preparing. At Buckley Space Force Base, crowds were forming at the gates, off-duty airmen, veterans, families, even civilians who monitored emergency frequencies. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there for Phoenix, and beyond even that. The story was flooding social media. Hashtags were climbing by the second. Hashtag Phoenix 847. Hashtag Bring Them Home. People posted memories, photos, fragments of encounters. A retired maintainer. "She saved my son's squadron in Afghanistan. She saved them now." A commercial pilot. "I trained in her emergency procedures. If anyone can do this, she can." A military spouse. "My husband flew with Phoenix. She never left anyone behind in the cockpit. None of that mattered." Sarah's universe was compressed to dials, altitudes, speeds. Her hand rested steady on the yoke. Eyes scanning. "Mike, keep her nose just below the horizon. We want controlled fall. Not glide, Lisa. Give me airspeed every 10 knots. 250. 240. Chun's voice ticked off numbers. Outside, Hawk and Viper held tight. Amy's voice broke the radio silence briefly. "Phoenix, you've got 2 Raptors on your 6. Guardian angels, ma'am. You're not alone." Sarah's lips pressed into the faintest smile. She never answered, but her chest tightened. Not alone. Not this time. The descent began in earnest. Colorado's ridgeline stretched out below. The Rockies painted gold in the late sun. The cabin groaned under pressure. Passengers clutched hands tighter. At Denver Tower, controllers leaned forward, every eye on radar. "United 847, you are cleared to land. Any way you need. We are with you." It wasn't protocol anymore. It was prayer. In the cabin, the panic had gone quiet. Not gone, but transfigured. Fear tempered by a strange solidarity. a shared moment between 124 strangers who now trusted. One woman they had never known before this flight. In the cockpit, Sarah narrowed her eyes, jaw set. Every adjustment was muscle against metal, instinct against physics. The 757 was wounded, but not beaten, not yet. The Earth loomed closer. Denver's grid stretching toward the horizon. Runway 16 right waited, lined with flashing lights and silent vehicles. Denver approach, United 847 on final descent. Sarah transmitted, her tone unshakable. Be advised, this approach will not be standard. Prepare for impact procedures. The reply came soft, almost reverent. Phoenix. The whole world is listening. Bring them home. Sarah's fingers flexed on the controls. Her heart steady. She didn't hear the world. She heard only the engines, the wind, the life of the bird in her hands. She wasn't in seat 13F anymore. She was Phoenix, and Phoenix had work to do. How does a moment stretch into eternity? At 4:47 p.m., with the Colorado sun angling low across the Rockies, United Flight 847 began its final descent. To passengers, the runway below looked impossibly far, yet rushing up with terrifying speed. To Sarah Martinez, it was mathematics and instinct balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Denver approach, United 847. Beginning final approach, runway 16 right, she transmitted. Her voice was calm, deliberate, the voice of someone who refused to blink. In the face of disaster, United 847, Denver approach. Runway clear. Emergency services in position, Colonel Martinez. The controller hesitated, then continued with reverence. The entire aviation community is pulling for you. Sarah didn't acknowledge the weight. She couldn't. Her focus was narrowed to a razor's edge. Mike, hold us at 180 knots. We need extra authority. Forget the book numbers. Lisa, call out every 10 knots. No gaps. Thompson's knuckles blanched against the yoke. His voice cracked just once. Sarah, this feels too fast. It is, she admitted, eyes unblinking. On the horizon, but too slow and we lose control. Better to fight speed than gravity. The Boeing rattled, shuddering as if resenting every command. The cabin moaned under the stress. Passengers gripped armrests, strangers' hands, crosses, whatever anchor they could find in row 15. Maria Santos held her twin boys tight, whispering a lie she needed to believe. She's going to get us home. The nice lady pilot has done this before. Robert Kim had stopped pretending at composure. His eyes were glassy as he pressed palms together, lips moving in silent prayer. Behind him, college students had abandoned bravado, tears sliding down cheeks as they whispered Phoenix's name like a mantra. At the back, Jennifer Walsh's voice was calm, but her hands trembled as she walked the aisle. Brace positions. Heads down. Stay tight. She caught the eyes of passengers, strangers, all of them, and felt an unfamiliar surge of faith. Outside, Hawk and Viper flew tight formation. Raptors pacing the crippled airliner like guardians, their radios filled with terse updates. Airspeed, altitude, angle. Every call carried a current of awe. Phoenix, Hawk, you're holding steady. Steady enough, Sarah murmured, mostly to herself. Altitude 1,000. First Officer Chun announced. Airspeed 185. Good, Sarah said. Mike, shallow flare at 50 feet. We're not gliding. Fly her onto the deck. Copy, Thompson replied. Though fear laced his voice, the cockpit windows filled with concrete. Denver's runway stretching ahead like salvation on the ground. 39 emergency vehicles lined the pavement. Fire trucks foamed. Ambulances idling. Crash crews at the ready. Airport personnel stood in silent formation, eyes skyward in Buckley's operations center. Families, veterans, and airmen crowded around screens. At Langley, Webb stood motionless, lips pressed tight. At Ramstein, tired pilots leaned over radios. Across living rooms, hangars, and control towers worldwide, people listened, breath held. 500 feet. Airspeed 182. Flare at 50, Mike, trust me. 200 feet. The runway filled every angle of glass. Emergency lights flared against the dusk. 180 even. Sarah's voice cut sharp. Now, Mike. Flare. Easy back pressure. Fly her down. The yoke groaned under Thompson's grip, resisting, fighting every inch. For one terrible second, the nose pitched too far. The left wing dipped. The aircraft wavered. Sarah's hand shot forward, her palm steadying his motion with surgical precision. That's it. Hold, hold. The main gears slammed down hard, but on the runway, tires shrieked. The Boeing shuddered like it might tear apart, but it was down. The nose followed, slamming to pavement. The entire cabin lurched. Screams, gasps, hands white-knuckled against. Restraints, reverse thrust maximum. Sarah barked. Thompson shoved the levers. The engines roared, a banshee howl as they fought to eat momentum. The plane bucked, rattling loose items from overheads. Airspeed 100. Lisa called, her voice a lifeline. 80. Emergency vehicles paced them along parallel taxiways, lights strobing. 60. 50. The runway end markers flashed closer, closer too fast, too near. 40. The Boeing groaned, metal straining against physics. The cabin shook violently. Sarah's hand gripped the console hard enough to leave prints. Then silence, weight settled. The aircraft rolled to a stop, 800 yards shy of the end of runway 16 right. For a beat, no one moved. The cockpit was still, broken only by ragged breathing. Captain Thompson's voice cracked the silence, hoarse and disbelieving. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport. The cabin erupted. Applause, sobs, prayers. Strangers clutched each other, laughter mixing with tears. But Sarah didn't celebrate. She looked out through the cockpit window. Red and white lights flashed against twilight. Vehicles closed in. She exhaled slowly, her heart finally daring to stutter. Mike, Lisa, she said softly, her tone firm again. Our job isn't finished until everyone's off safely. Let's get them out. They nodded, dazed but obedient. In the cabin, Jennifer's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled as she clapped her hands and called out, "We're safe. Stay seated until instructed help is here." Maria Santos sobbed openly, kissing her boys' heads again and again. Robert Kim dropped his face into his palms, shoulders shaking with relief. But even as passengers wept and cheered, Sarah sat still, calm, dignified. For her, this wasn't triumph. It was duty, a mission completed. Nothing more. Outside, the Raptors circled once overhead before peeling away, banking sharply toward Buckley. Hawk's voice came across the frequency one last time, filled with something like reverence. "Phoenix, you did it. You brought them home." Sarah keyed her mic, her reply simple, quiet. "Copy, Hawk. Thanks for the escort." And as she set the headset down, she let the smallest truth slip through her thoughts. She hadn't been just a passenger. Not ever. She was Phoenix, and Phoenix always brought them home. Why did the story refuse to fade? 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the shadows of the Air Force Academy auditorium. Waiting to step onto the stage, rows of cadets filled the seats in immaculate uniforms, their faces alight with anticipation. They weren't here for a general, or a politician, or even a medal ceremony. They were here because the woman in seat 13F had become something larger than herself. She shifted on her feet, still uneasy with the attention. The jeans and sweater she'd worn that day had been retired, folded in a drawer she never opened. To her, it had been a flight gone wrong, a mission she hadn't volunteered for but had completed because duty demanded it. To the world, it had become something else. The night after the landing, images of her standing on the tarmac, Returning the salute of hundreds had spread across headlines and screens. Phoenix rises again. Hero in 13F, the passenger, who saved 127 lives. She hadn't given a single interview. She hadn't needed to. The photographs spoke for themselves. In the days that followed, letters flooded her mailbox. Parents thanking her for inspiring their children, veterans writing of their pride, strangers confessing that in her story, they'd found courage to face their own battles. She hadn't known what to do with it. Heroes were supposed to be larger than life, unshakable. She was just a woman who had done what needed to be done. But then, wasn't that the truth of heroism? Colonel Martinez, the academy commander, said softly beside her, "They're ready." She nodded and walked onto the stage. The cadets rose as one, a thunder of boots echoing. The sight caught in her throat hundreds of young men and women. The future of the Air Force, saluting her. She raised her hand, precise as always, and returned the gesture. Then she stepped to the podium. Her voice was steady, low but clear. 6 months ago, I boarded a commercial flight wearing civilian clothes. I wanted to disappear, to be just another face in the crowd. But life has a way of calling us when we least expect it. And that day, the call came at 35,000 feet. The room was silent, every ear bent forward. I'm not here to talk about heroics. There were none. What happened that day was not one person's triumph. It was a crew, a group of strangers, a community that chose to trust each other when fear could have torn us apart. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Every passenger, every crew member was part of that courage. She paused, scanning the sea of young faces. Some looked at her with awe, some with tears, some with hungry ambition. She softened her tone. Don't put people like me on pedestals. Heroes aren't untouchable. They're ordinary people who do what's needed when others are counting on them. One day, that will be you, and you won't feel ready. You won't feel brave, but you will act, because service means you no longer live just for yourself. A long silence followed, heavy and profound. Then the applause began, not wild, but steady, rising like a tide. Sarah bowed her head slightly, humbled again. Outside, after the ceremony, cadets crowded her. They asked about the Boeing, about her call sign, about her career. One young woman, no older than 20, clutched her hand with trembling fingers. "Ma'am, I never believed I could belong here." "Until I heard your story." Sarah squeezed back, her voice low. "You already belong. Just remember, you don't have to be fearless. You just have to show up when it matters." That night, back in her quarters, Sarah sat alone by the window, watching stars scatter across the Colorado sky. Her mother had been there earlier, holding her hand, proud but worried. Elena had called 3 times, her voice sharp with sisterly scolding and love. Messages blinked on her phone from people she hadn't spoken to in years. The world had turned her into a symbol. She didn't feel like one. But maybe that was the point. Symbols weren't chosen. They were made by the lives they touched, in quiet moments. Sarah replayed the sound of that grinding metal, the sight of Denver's runway rising too fast, the weight of 127 lives pressing against her chest. She knew the outcome could have been different. Heroes weren't guaranteed survival. And yet, she'd been given another day, another chance. The thought humbled her more than any medal ever had. Across the country, her story lived on. Military classrooms analyzed her decisions. Civilian flight schools referenced her techniques. Social media still carried the hashtags, #Phoenix847 and #BringThemHome. But what mattered to her wasn't the myth. It was the letters from children who wanted to serve, from passengers who said they now lived differently, from cadets who carried her words into training flights. She thought of Danny Wilson, clutching his signed boarding pass like treasure. She wondered if one day he'd stand in a flight suit, staring down a sky that wanted to kill him. If so, she hoped he'd remember her words. She didn't know what the future would bring: more service, more sacrifice, perhaps more moments when the world asked too much. But she knew this. She would never again believe she could disappear. Seat 13F had stripped her of anonymity. And perhaps that was what she needed, to remember that hiding was not living. That service did not end when the uniform came off. As she leaned back, the stars sharp against the dock, she let a quiet thought rise. Not pride, not grief. Something steadier, hope for the cadets, for the strangers on that flight. For the idea that ordinary lives could brush against extraordinary moments and leave the world changed. Sarah Martinez, Phoenix, the reluctant passenger in seat 13F, allowed herself a rare, quiet smile. Sometimes, legends aren't born from war. Sometimes they're born from the silence between breaths, the choice to act when others cannot. And that truth, she thought, was worth every scar she carried. Why was everyone staring at her? The engines wound down with a groan. The aircraft surrounded by fire trucks, ambulances, flashing lights that painted the twilight in red and white. Sarah Martinez sat motionless in the cockpit jump seat, headset off, listening to the quiet. Not silence exactly, breathing, shuffling, sobs of relief behind the cockpit door. But compared to the chaos of descent, it felt like stillness. Captain Thompson leaned back, his face pale, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He laughed, once half disbelief, half exhaustion. In 23 years of flying, he whispered, I've never experienced anything like that. Sarah glanced at him, her expression calm but unyielding. You flew her down, I just advised. Lisa Chun shook her head with a faint smile, her voice ragged. Ma'am, with all due respect, that was the most extraordinary display of airmanship I've ever witnessed. Sarah looked away, down at the controls she just commanded like a surgeon over failing organs. She didn't answer. Humility was armor. Then Jennifer appeared at the cockpit door. Her eyes glistened, composure frayed but not broken. Colonel Martinez, she said softly, there are people outside. They'd like to see you. Sarah frowned. People? Jennifer only nodded, a faint smile trembling on her lips. You'll see. Sarah followed her through the narrow cabin. Passengers were still strapped in, but now they watched her with something new reverence. Robert Kim reached out as she passed, gripping her sleeve. You saved us, he said, tears in his eyes. Maria Santos pressed her twin small hands together in thanks. The college student stared at her like she was a living myth. She nodded to them all, saying nothing. Dignity didn't boast at the aircraft door. The portable stairs had been wheeled into place. Sarah stepped into the fading light of the Denver evening and froze on the tarmac below, lined with perfect precision, stood a formation of military personnel, airmen in flight suits, retired veterans in faded caps, guardsmen still in their day uniforms, even military spouses and children holding flags. They stretched across the tarmac in rows, silent and still. At the front stood Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez in his flight gear, his wingman Captain Amy Viper Chun beside him. Hawk's voice carried across the quiet. Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez, on behalf of the United States Air Force and the aviation community, we request permission to render honors. The words hit harder than any landing. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her throat close. They weren't honoring a rank, not a medal, not even a miracle landing. They were honoring her. Her voice came steady despite the turbulence inside. Permission granted, Hawk snapped to attention and saluted. Viper followed, and then, like a wave rolling across the formation, every service member raised their hand in unison, enlisted and officers, active and retired, all saluting the woman who had just reminded the world what service meant. Sarah stood, tall, spine straight, the sweater she wore suddenly feeling like a uniform she'd never removed. She returned the salute with perfect precision. The silence was absolute. broken only by the distant whine of engines and the soft clicks of cameras. Capturing history, when the salute lowered, Hawk stepped forward. His voice was softer now, personal. "Ma'am, you've been a legend to us for years. Today, you reminded everyone why." Behind him came others. Master Sergeant Tony Castellanos, her old crew chief, eyes wet. "Phoenix, you haven't changed. Still making the impossible look easy." Captain Janet Spike Williams, once her trainee, now an instructor herself. "You taught me to trust the impossible. I wouldn't be here without you." Chief Master Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, from her Afghanistan squadron, stepped close. "Phoenix," he said simply, using her call sign like a badge of kinship. "Back. Then you brought us all home. Today, you brought them home. Some things never change." Sarah shook her head, voice quiet but firm. "I didn't do it alone. None of us ever do." And then small footsteps. Danny Wilson, just 8 years old, broke from his mother's grasp and approached with the boldness only children carry. He looked up at her, eyes wide. "Ma'am, are you really a fighter pilot?" Sarah knelt, her knees creaking against the pavement. She met his gaze with warmth, the kind she rarely let the world see. "I am, Danny, and today, I got to help Captain Thompson and First Officer Chun fly your airplane home safe. My dad says fighter pilots are the bravest people in the world." Danny said solemnly, "Are you brave?" Sarah considered the question carefully, as though it were the most important of her life. "I think brave people are just ordinary people who do what needs to be done when others are counting on them. Today, everyone on that plane was brave. Your mom, the passengers, the crew, we all worked together." Danny nodded, satisfied, then held up a crumpled boarding pass. "Will you sign this?" Her chest tightened, but she smiled. "I'd be honored." She wrote carefully, "To Danny, remember, heroes are ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Aim high. Colonel Sarah, Phoenix Martinez." USF, as she handed it back. Passengers began approaching to Maria, introducing her twins. Robert Kim simply asking to shake her hand. The students requesting a photo. Each encounter humbled Sarah more than medals ever had. She realized something profound as the crowd pressed close. The legend wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to them, to every person who would tell the story of the woman in seat 13F who rose to save them. And for the first time in years, Sarah let herself feel it. Not pride, not glory, something gentler. Belonging. The military formation broke into informal knots of conversation. Laughter, tears, journalists hovered, cameras whirring, but no one shoved forward. Respect held them back. This was more than a story. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, the sweater still clinging to her shoulders, the weight of her oath heavier than ever. She hadn't asked for this moment. She hadn't wanted it, but perhaps that was the point. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What does the world remember when the noise fades? It wasn't the screech of tires on Denver's runway, or the roar of engines straining against physics. It wasn't even the photos of flashing lights across the tarmac, or the salutes raised. In twilight, months later, what people remembered was quieter. The stillness after survival, the silence in which gratitude bloomed. Sarah Martinez walked slowly along the flight line at Buckley, the morning air crisp, the mountains sharp against a pale sky. Her uniform hung neat on her shoulders again, the patches familiar, the weight of it grounding. She had avoided the spotlight, declined most interviews, but the world hadn't let the story die. Every few weeks, another article appeared. Another new segment aired. Another young cadet stood tall and said Phoenix inspired them. She hadn't wanted any of it. She had just wanted to fly home, sit in seat 13F, close her eyes, and forget the war she'd fought. But fate had whispered otherwise. "Colonel." She turned. Hawk stood waiting, hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of respect and camaraderie. He'd become something of a brother to her since that day. The kind of bond forged not by time but by shared fire. "They're holding a memorial at the academy tonight," Hawk said, "for crews lost in training accidents. They'd like you to say a few words." Sarah's instinct was to decline. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't a symbol. But she saw the look in his eyes, the unspoken truth that sometimes words weren't for the speaker, but for those who needed to hear them. That evening, she stood again before rows of uniforms, but this time the air was heavier. Names were read aloud, candles flickered. Silence pressed down like gravity. When she finally stepped forward, she didn't speak of heroics. She spoke of absence, of quiet barracks after a loss, of helmets left on empty chairs, of families holding folded flags. Her voice caught once, but she didn't hide it. "The world remembers legends," she said, softly, "but we remember the people, the laughter, the stubbornness, the tiny things that made them ours. That's what lives on." Cadets wept openly, officers bowed heads, and in that fragile silence, Sarah realized something. Her story was no longer hers. It had become a vessel, carrying countless others with it. Afterward, walking alone beneath the stars, she let the truth settle. The landing had not defined her. The salute had not defined her. Even the legend of Phoenix had not defined her. What defined her were the choices made when no one was watching. In Afghan valleys, when she turned back for a downed wingman, in quiet hospitals, when she sat with families of the fallen in seat 13F, when she could have stayed silent but didn't. Service wasn't about glory. It was about presence. A week later, she found herself boarding another commercial flight. This one routine. Uneventful, she settled into her seat, 13F by coincidence or fate, and looked out at the wing. The hum of engines filled her ears. She noticed a man beside her glancing nervously at the safety card, gripping the armrest too tight, his knuckles pale, his breathing shallow. Fear lived in him. She leaned over gently, her voice quiet. "First time flying?" He nodded, embarrassed. I don't really trust it. These things go down." Sarah smiled faintly, a calm steadiness in her tone. "I can promise you. They're built to fly, and the crews who sit up front, they give everything to bring you home safe. Trust them." He studied her, something in her eyes easing the panic in his chest. He nodded slowly. His hands loosened. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes. She didn't tell him who she was. She didn't need to. The engines rumbled. The jet lifted. The sky opened wide. And in that moment, Sarah understood. Her life had never been about being noticed. It had been about presence in the right place, the right time, with the right courage. The world called her Phoenix, but she knew herself simply as Sarah, someone who showed up when it mattered. The plane leveled off, clouds glowing gold against the sun. She exhaled, slow and steady. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.